Oh, blessings, good evening. It's a Tuesday night, so we have some questions coming to answer. First question. May I know if Pure Land is the equivalent to Dusita heaven? How is it possible for one to be reborn into Pure Land and attain to enlightenment from there without future births? Does it mean they are already Aryas? There's a little bit of perhaps some confusion or mixing between what you might call the straight Theravada teachings and the Mahayana teachings. Pure Land is a tradition that grew up, obviously it's part of Buddhism, grew up in China a few hundred years after the Buddha. As Buddhism spread north from India with the, you might say, heroic efforts of several Chinese monks over different centuries coming to India, travelling there, studying, practicing, researching, and then taking the teachings back to China. Buddhism spread, but this seems to have been a slight kind of variation that developed the Pure Land, linked to perhaps the Bodhisattva ideal and the worship, practice in honour and worship of deities, bodhisattvas, such as Amita Buddha or Maitreya Buddha, the next Buddha, who is obviously not yet a Buddha. Maitreya Buddha, they believe, is a bodhisattva. So bodhisattvas are usually considered, when they're haven't taken a human birth, then they're usually in the Dusita heaven realm, as our Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, before he was born in his final life. He was Sandusit Devabhuta in the Dusita heaven realm. So this tradition, in brief, I mean, I'm not an expert, I'm afraid, because I'm a Theravada monk, but in brief, it's the practices that have developed around this aspiration to be reborn in a heaven with a bodhisattva who will guide, teach, protect you in that heaven realm until you reach enlightenment yourself. So there's still the same aspiration for nibbana, the end of suffering, enlightenment, as you find throughout the Buddhist teachings, but the variation is a particular emphasis on practices that will lead to rebirth in the pure abodes, they say. So this is particularly chanting, studying, making offerings, the practice of dana, and the practice of meditation, particularly things like reciting the name of the Buddha, such as Amitabha Buddha, or any other Buddha like Maitreya Buddha. Very similar to what we have in Theravada Buddhism, what we call Buddhanusati, recollection, the name, and recollecting the Buddha as a meditation. There's definitely many similarities, but the emphasis is on being reborn in the pure abode, Pure Land, with a bodhisattva to guide you there, say. But there has been some confusion, partly because this more traditional Theravada teaching talks about the development of the Noble Eightfold Path, the gradual abandoning of the 10 fetters. So the Sotapanna, the stream enterer, abandons the first 3 fetters. The Sakadagami, once returner, abandons some of the next 2 fetters. That is, sensual desire, ill will are weakened but not completely abandoned. But the Anagami, the 3rd level of noble ones, has completely abandoned the first 5 fetters, including sensual desire, ill will, which are centered around attachment and identification with the body as a self, the human physical body, and particularly sense desire that arises based on having a body and senses. That's been abandoned by the anagami. So the anagami translates as a non-returner. They're not yet arahant, not yet fully enlightened, but if one was to attain that in this life, and when one dies, one, according to the texts, both the Sutta and the Abhidhamma, and according to commentaries and teachers, generally teachers of meditation, an anagami, once they die, they're not yet enlightened, but they're reborn in what we call the Suttavasa realms, Brahma realms. There's 5 Brahma realms where anagamis are born, depending on the strength and the particular spiritual faculty that is prominent in their practice. So 5 spiritual faculties: sattva, faith; virya, energy; sati, mindfulness; samadhi, concentration or calm; panya, wisdom, insight. These 5 faculties kind of differentiate between the 5 Suttavasa Brahma realms where anagamis are reborn, and they attain nibbana there in those Brahma realms. They're not reborn as humans again, hence the term non-returner. And sometimes there seems to be a little bit of a confusion in Buddhist minds about these 2 places, because they sound similar. Sometimes they're called the pure abodes, Suttavasa Brahma realms. But they're different from Dusita heaven, which is still considered one of the sensual heaven realms. And Dusita heaven, people who have attained samadhi may be reborn there, people who are bodhisattvas or people who have made good karma, men and women die, they can be reborn in Dusita heaven, the heaven of the peaceful. So particularly people who have meditated and developed some skill with meditation may be reborn there. That's different from an anagami reborn in a Brahma realm. So there's a little bit of confusion sometimes, you see, it seems, in people's minds. Also the idea of, in Mahayana Buddhism, the idea of the Buddha who stays on and teaches. So we have this Amitabha Buddha, the kind of eternal Buddha. Whereas, looking through the eyes of a Theravada practitioner, maybe still deluded or wrong, so I'm not saying everyone knows everything. Amitabha Buddha would be considered a bodhisattva, although one who has a lot of barami and has made their barami for a long time. And so somebody who's been around a long time and will be around a long time seems almost eternal, but they're still a bodhisattva and they're still subject to birth and death. And whenever they die, that being dies from being Amitabha Buddha, they would be reborn and become a Buddha, and a Buddha is not reborn again. So there's some differences around the definition of a Buddha, what a Buddha is, what they do after their enlightenment, and so on. But you don't have to get caught too much up in the differences and the arguments around there, although it's probably good to study it and learn what the different schools teach, Mahayana, Theravada and so on. But also to notice, more importantly, the practices which come from the same origin, the enlightened Buddha, aiming for the same goal, the freedom from suffering. However, in different countries, different traditions, there's sometimes slight emphasis and variation in practice. But people practicing Pure Land Buddhism, I've met many, and they seem to be very good people with sincere faith. I've met very good people in Theravada Buddhism as well, with sincere faith, practicing for Nibbana. So perhaps on the outside there's not a lot of difference. But maybe internally the view and the sort of goals and aspirations may slightly vary, perhaps. Perhaps it's a matter of karma, your affinity, which tradition, which school, which teacher you have an affinity with and have made karma with in the past. Well, that may steer you in one direction or another in this life. But I've given Dhamma teachings to Pure Land Buddhists before, no problem. And interesting to know, they tend to ask a lot about the wisdom side of the teachings, the vipassana practices. Perhaps they've been underplayed or lost a little bit in China, Japan, the countries where Pure Land is sort of practiced more commonly. They seem to have lost the vipassana tradition a little bit. Having said that, sometimes in the Theravada community you get sort of anti-bodhisattva and anti-Pure Land comments and views as well, so be careful of that, because attachment to any view with a strong sense of self leads to suffering, hence the conflicts and arguments. So be wary of that. Dear Lumpur, you sometimes hear people say that you need the right karma to meet someone such as a teacher. What does this actually mean? Does it mean you can't go and look for a teacher? You have to wait to meet them. Is there any way you can change the karma between two people in this life? Thank you. I would say it's a very risky plan just to sit and wait for your teacher to approach you. If you read the lives of the great arahants in the modern era or in the time of the Buddha, I don't think many people did that. If you read, for example, Mahakassapa, he went off from home to the homeless life looking for a teacher. And he was lucky because he met the Buddha sitting under a tree, radiating the rainbow aura of a Buddha, which probably was quite something. And for someone who already had a lot of good karma, probably could meditate already quite well, had a lot of renunciation, mindfulness, many good qualities already as a layman. Seeing this rainbow aura of the Buddha seemed to be what was needed. And it was like, aha, this is my teacher. He was attracted or inspired by that. And it's a very common kind of scenario for monks and nuns. Men and women coming in contact with the Buddha, something gives them confidence in the Buddha, draws them in to want to listen to his teachings, practice, follow. And the same with other teachers. Say in the modern era, people like Ajahn Chah. People get drawn to Ajahn Chah. It's not just an intellectual thing, his words certainly make good sense, and he was a good speaker, could answer questions, could give good explanations, very down-to-earth, practical teachings that people appreciated. But there was also a feeling. You meet someone like Ajahn Chah, you feel peaceful, you feel this person is different. And then maybe over a long period you see and know what a teacher is like. By living with them, you get to know their level of sila, their level of understanding, whether they display defilements in various ways, defiled thinking in the way they talk and explain things, defilements in forms of greed or anger in daily life. There's another way you get to know teachers over time, living with them. But very rarely do you hear stories of somebody just sitting at home doing nothing and a teacher turning up on the doorstep saying, okay, I'm going to teach you. I don't hear about that. Maybe in the history of Buddhism it has happened because so many different scenarios probably have happened. But I would say that's the lazy man's way or lazy woman's way to get to Nibbana, just sitting there waiting for your teacher. You've got to make a bit of effort, don't you? Especially when you're new to the practice. You can't expect every great teacher to just sort of come along and sort you out, spoon feed the Dhamma to you, pick you up. You have to show your faith, your commitment, your interest first, and then they may respond to that. Is a much more natural, more likely scenario. You travel and look for the teacher. And true, sometimes we look for teachers and we don't yet immediately find the person that we find we're confident with, or something doesn't click, or it just could be a language problem or something. That does happen. But it's coming from your effort. You're going out looking for the teacher, isn't it? You go and look and you say yes or no, seems right, doesn't seem right. That's from your effort. It's not the teacher going looking for you. To name but a few people, myself and a few others, Ajahn Chah, people travelled thousands and thousands of miles to get to meet Ajahn Chah and offer themselves as students to Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah did travel to the West on a couple of occasions, but not for very long. But the more likely thing that happened was people would travel to Thailand looking for a teacher. Maybe they'd heard of Ajahn Chah already, or they were just looking for a good teacher and they were directed in his direction. And they went through a lot of effort to get there. Again, everyone is different, isn't it? Some people sort of travel towards Ajahn Chah, but maybe they were travelling for something else and then came across Ajahn Chah. Other people made a beeline for Ajahn Chah, just heading for him straight away. It all depends. But I think most people have to look for the teacher. They have to make that effort. It's not just a physical search. It's also you have to make the effort in the sense you have to prepare yourself for a teacher. You have to start practicing the Dhamma in whatever form you can. Listening, which is now easy, listening online, reading online, learning to meditate, learning to keep precepts, studying the teachings, thinking about them, understanding them from wherever you are first, and then developing a sense of, if I meet a teacher, that would be really a good thing in my life, an appreciation of what a teacher is, what they can do for you. And they can save you a lot of time and stress by showing you the way where you might not find that way on your own, or showing you where you've gone wrong even, because sometimes we go wrong. But you also have to be ready for that. You have to prepare yourself, because a teacher is not just going to tell you what you want to hear, they're also going to tell you what you probably don't want to hear, because they're pointing out your faults, where you're wrong in your thinking, where you're lazy, where you're selfish, where you're angry, where things are not right in your practice. They might point that out to you either directly or sometimes indirectly, and you won't always like that at first. That not liking is not really you, it's your defilements reacting to somebody pointing them out, picking them out, revealing them to you. They don't like that. So this is a way forest monks often talk. We say, the defilements are fighting back, or the defilements are not happy, or the defilements are complaining. So the teacher says, meditate more, stay up later, eat less food, sleep less, talk less, indulge less in kind of distractions and entertainments and things, meditate more, put more effort into developing mindfulness. A lot of people don't want to hear that, because it sounds like hard work and not much fun. So often people, they get a good teacher and then they run away from the teacher, because they don't want to hear what the teacher has to say. Even though the teacher is pointing the way to Nibbana, they're not ready for it. They run away. That's quite common. Occasionally they even blame the teacher, say, this teacher's no good, when the teacher has actually pointed out the treasure chest of the Dhamma, we call it, the treasure of the Dhamma, to them, said where the treasure is buried. So if you practice in this way, you will abandon defilements, your attachment to sense of self, your wrong views, your delusions. They've shown the way, but then we don't like it. The defilements don't like it, so the defilements run away and try to get away. Sometimes it's like that. You see a person, it could be a monastic or a lay person, they go to a good teacher like Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Mahabua or someone else, and they're there and the teacher says something that sets them off, and the person starts squirming, physically squirming, mentally squirming, because the teacher has put their finger on the very the worst or the deepest attachment of that person. And the attachment, the defilement, doesn't like it. So there's a reaction. Oh, this teacher's no good. Or sometimes even more subtle, they meet the teacher. Like there was one monk I knew, he was so stubborn and proud, he didn't listen to anyone, he only listened to his own views, which at first is difficult. It's a problem, because if your views are wrong, well, you're going to listen to a lot of wrong views in your mind. And that's what this monk did, and everyone around him knew it. And he went to see one enlightened teacher. And the enlightened teacher tried teaching him a few times and realized nothing is going to change this guy. He's so stubborn, so fixed in his views. So he said, there's no point staying here anymore. You're in my monastery. There's nothing more I can teach you. And so the defilements of this monk interpreted that to say, oh, I must be enlightened, because he said there's nothing more he can teach me. So he went away telling everyone, I'm enlightened now. So sometimes people do that. They just interpret things in their own way, according to their own defilements, their own prejudices, wrong views, and they miss the good teacher altogether sometimes. Or they get angry with the teacher, or they compete with the teacher, want to be as good as the teacher. All kinds of reactions to teachers come up. So it's not an easy thing. You have to prepare yourself for the teacher. Be ready, be willing to listen, be willing to follow. Like Tuchabhotila in the time of the Buddha, this monk who knew a lot and could answer every question and quote the Buddha and quote all the teachings and answer every question that people had. So he thought, I've made it. But then one day he went to the Buddha and the Buddha said, here comes empty scripture. Meaning he knows a lot intellectually, his memory is good, he's understood and listened and learned a lot, but he hasn't practiced it. He's empty of the Dhamma inside. So he went off to find a teacher. He, in a way, he did a good thing. He said, I'm going to go off and find a true teacher who will teach me the way to enlightenment. I'm just going to start walking in one direction. In the end, you can only walk in one direction. He said, I'm going to start in this direction, and the first teacher I come across who's enlightened, I'm going to give myself to them, commit to them. And nothing's going to sway me now, because he'd spent many years in the robes and he'd realized he'd lost his way because he'd become very puffed up, arrogant because of his book knowledge. So he said, I'm not going to leave them. Once I find them, I'm just going to give up to this teacher and practice with them. So he's walking and he came across a little forest hermitage, walks in, and it's clean, very good atmosphere, clean and tidy, just a few little huts. He says, oh, this looks good place, looks like a real place of practice, well kept, simple but clean. And he met one little novice, just a young boy novice, sweeping the leaves. And he came in and he said, oh, where's the teacher? And the novice said something like, oh, the teacher's around here, there is a teacher here, yeah, you'll find him. And he said, oh, what's the teacher's name? The novice gave his own name. And then he said, what's your name? And he gave his name. He said, oh, so you're the teacher. So this little boy, novice, is the teacher in this hermitage. And he said, so you're the teacher here. I hear you're enlightened. And the novice was probably very humble and said, well, I know what I know. But he seemed very peaceful, very wise and knowledgeable. So this monk humbled himself, this older, knowledgeable monk said, okay, can I give myself to you as my meditation master? I'm going to practice with you till I'm enlightened. And the novice said, yes, but on one condition. You have to prove you're really sincere, because so many people come here and they're not sincere. They see a little boy, they think, well, I can't learn from him. Or they're here for a few days and they leave. So many people are like that. You have to prove that you're committed to the teacher by doing whatever I say. He said, yep, whatever you say, I'm going to do it. So I said, okay, the first test of your commitment, we're going out the back of the monastery. And he went out the back of the monastery and there's a swamp. And he said, just start walking as fast as you can, or even running into the swamp. And don't stop until I tell you. And the monk looks at the novice and says, what is this? Well, it is a test. Okay, he understood that. He wasn't very happy because the swamp was full of muddy, smelly water. It wasn't a nice swamp. Okay, it's a test. So he goes charging into the swamp really fast. And of course it's full of mud, so he starts to sink in the mud, and all his very fine robes, because he's been a very famous, well-supported teacher, he's got these fine robes. They all get muddy and smelly. The mud is coming up, the water's coming up, and he's struggling. But the novice doesn't say stop yet, so he just carries on till he's almost up to his mouth in water. He's almost head deep in the water. Finally, the novice says, stop. So he's passed the test, he stops, and then he's got to crawl out of the swamp, come back all muddy, smelly, but the novice says, that was very good, you can stay here. And after that he stayed with the teacher and did everything he was told, kept the precepts, did his meditation. The teacher gave him a meditation object, taught him how to do it, and he stayed there until he was enlightened. That's the kind of classic, pass the test, stay with the teacher until you're enlightened. Just do what the teacher says. The teacher says stay, you go, you stay, you leave it up to the teacher, you don't follow your own desires. That's the ideal. May not be easy to achieve, but we have to make the effort if we want a teacher. You can't just sit there waiting for a teacher to come to you. Next question. What can we do to increase our loved ones' faith in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha? Practice. If you become enlightened, you're definitely going to be able to inspire your loved ones to practice, I think. Many have. Even if you haven't become enlightened yet, if you're committed to the practice, the people around you will see that, and some of them probably will be inspired and follow. So number one is be a good example yourself. You have to show your commitment to the practice, sincere commitment, so do it. Learn to meditate, listen to the Dhamma, reflect on the Dhamma every day, practice dana in different ways, keep the precepts, learn some chanting. All the very ordinary practices we do, the more you put effort, sincere effort into that, the better for the people around you. There'll be subtle, indirect benefits. If you're more peaceful, more mindful, have more understanding of Dhamma, that will come out in the way you behave. And then there'll be direct benefits. You can actually give advice to your family members and friends. You can show them what to do if they don't know how to meditate. You can show them, and so on. So, be a good example yourself is number one, and then just encourage the people around you to do more good. Dana, sila, bhavana, generosity, morality, meditation. Encourage that in them. Next question. If we meditate on the object of metta, goodwill, does it really work? Well, if you're happy to take my word for it, yeah, I'd say it does work. But I would recommend you try for yourself so that you're speaking from experience. So when you have even just one thought of goodwill, how do you feel? Well, at that moment you don't have anger, and you probably feel a little speck or piece of calm in your mind when you bring up goodwill. If you have many moments of goodwill, you probably have many moments of peace, and it starts to get some cumulative effect, and you'll probably be a stronger, more powerful kind of meditation or just attitude you're developing in daily life if you practice it more as a meditation, and then in practical ways helping people, developing kindness in daily life through body, speech and mind. It will get stronger and have a more powerful effect. Sometimes we learn by watching others. Up to a point, you watch teachers, fellow practitioners, and see their good points and the strengths and the good character they have in their practice. But then you have to bring it in and practice and develop this for yourself, and then you'll have confidence in practicing metta and how to develop goodwill skillfully, not attached to it, not attached to the results of it, not expect too much from other people but still cultivate goodwill, and so on. You'll get better at it. But like everything, it takes effort. It's not just going to happen by itself. You have to put effort into the practice. So another question. Dear Ajahn Kalyano, I can understand a little about using strong samadhi to infuse our suffering so that we can see the Dhamma clearly for our ultimate liberation. But the idea of final nibbana being no more birth or going out like a flame extinguished is a little bit confusing. I mean, I can understand our erroneous view of self being extinguished, but I'm not sure if anyone wants to be non-existent. Please explain what ultimate liberation entails. Well, ultimate liberation is beyond words and language. So the kind of easy way out in this question is say, well, you can't talk about it because it's not something you can describe in words. So, nothing to say. But the idea of final nibbana being no more birth and going out like a flame extinguished, well, I would just think about that with an open mind to start with. A flame is hot, it's burning, it keeps going and burning up fuel, oxygen. But then if a flame is extinguished, it goes out, nothing more burns, nothing more is used up and consumed. Maybe there's something good in that. The extinguishing of fire, flame, means, stillness. Maybe what we are calling flame is the flame of greed, anger and delusion. This agitates the mind, whether it's subtle or very gross, coarse kinds of agitation. And I think most meditators have had enough of agitation of greed, anger and delusion. They may not yet be wise enough to completely abandon, but at least temporarily it's nice to practice mindfulness, let go of hindrances and different defilements as you're meditating and experience some stillness. I think most people appreciate that. And that gives you a taste of nibbana. This extinguishing of defilement, greed, anger and delusion and all their forms, is peaceful. It's enjoyable, it's pleasurable in the way of Dhamma. It's without suffering, it's without attachment. So it's going towards complete liberation, stillness, peace. We can also say it's going towards emptiness, but when we say emptiness, it's emptiness of suffering, emptiness of self and the attachment to self. Trouble is when we're just talking about practice, and particularly the higher parts and fruits of the practice, you're always trying to use words and concepts to describe something. It's a thing, it's like this. So Nibbana, we say, is beyond words. So as soon as you say Nibbana is a state of mind, or it's a place, or it's an experience that you have, it starts to become something a little bit less than it is, I think. And that's one of the problems. So even the idea of emptiness, you say, well, Nibbana is emptiness. So then there's this kind of idea, emptiness is the goal. And then people think, the more they think about emptiness, the more they feel it's kind of a bit of an anticlimax, it's a bit boring, it's a bit kind of, emptiness. So what? It doesn't sound very attractive in this world, which is full of stuff and non-emptiness. Emptiness as a concept, an idea, doesn't sound very attractive perhaps. But you have to remember, emptiness in the terms of the Dhamma is more about experiencing the ending of kilesas. So first of all, ending through developing some states of samadhi, calm, stillness, going beyond hindrances, but then ultimately developing insight into the selfless nature of five khandhas. Five khandhas are impermanent, suffering, not self. And if you cling to them, you start to create this self around them. But actually, they're not to be clung to. So emptiness doesn't necessarily mean absolutely nothing around. Like an arahant, until they die, they've reached nibbana, reached what we call emptiness, but they still have a body. They still speak. They can still do things until they die. But the mind is purified from the delusion of self, the wrong view of self. So they don't attach to their body and their feelings and their thoughts as self. They see them or know them as not self. So emptiness means absence of self-view, absence of sense of self, i.e. self, a self-existing thing, a being, a person, a soul. But this is something we have to know through the practice. So there's always going to be some limitations when we discuss it, but maybe look at how you relate to the idea of emptiness, the concept. You may find you might have a little bit of aversion there, sneaking into your thinking, oh, emptiness doesn't sound very good. Maybe you still have a desire for something. So nothing or emptiness seems not very good. So what is this desire for something you want? What is this something? How good is this something? Whatever it is you want, some kind of pleasure, happiness, existence, state of being. Maybe that's something to investigate. The traditional ones are, we say, I would like to be reborn in heaven. Or I'd like to attain jhana and then reborn as a Brahma and live forever and ever as a Brahma god or something. These are just examples. People have their views and they attach to the view maybe without investigating that attachment, that identification. Or the view that there's nothing. Another view. When you die, there's nothing, absolutely nothing. You could say another form of emptiness, but we call that nihilism. You're just seeing everything as just nothing, to the point where it's a view, which is something. On and on it goes. So we have to investigate views and attachments, I think. Dear Lumpur, I have heard this phrase, not being in the mind, but knowing the mind. Is the practice of purification of the mind ultimately that which leads to a mind that knows, and while pursuing the goal, we experience bits of knowing? My apology if my question is not clear. It isn't absolutely clear. It could be me. I don't know. I've heard the phrase not to be in the mind, but knowing the mind. Okay, well, that sort of indicates a kind of detached awareness of the mind as we are developing, 4 foundations of mindfulness. One of them is mindfulness of the mind, directed to the mind itself. To know, how do you know the mind, which is invisible? Well, you know it through the qualities and characteristics of the mind from moment to moment, so whether it's peaceful or not, in a skillful state, what we call a wholesome state, or an unskillful state. So partly you know that through the feeling, whether it's tense, stressed, in pain of one kind or another, or pleasure, whether the mind is calm and concentrated, or very distracted, dispersed, thinking a lot or not thinking much, one-pointed or no-pointed, all over the place. The characteristics of the mind help you to see the mind through its contents. Who sees the mind, who watches or knows the mind? Well, the mind itself. You're training the mind to look back or know, be aware of itself. It's not an easy thing to just sit down and do, but through practice maybe we start to get an insight into this whole thing. And what most people practicing in the way of the Buddha find is that the more they do this, the mind, getting to know the mind, the characteristics of impermanence, suffering and not self become more and more apparent. The mind is something that arises and ceases all the time, from moment to the moment. It's not just one state of mind, one object of mind all day, all night, forever and ever. Although sometimes it can seem like that, but that's a delusion. If you investigate it, you might see through that delusion. The mind is arising and ceasing, and what arises and ceases then can keep picking up different objects, different contents of mind come in and out of the mind all the time. Some good, some bad, some peaceful, some disturbed. In one moment happy, one moment sad, one moment angry, one moment peaceful. But you're seeing the mind that is the kind of vessel containing all this different activity. And the sharper, the clearer your mindfulness, the more you can see this vessel there and not get so caught up and deluded by all the contents as it's going about its business. So yeah, you're probably right. We have moments of awareness, mindfulness and insight into the way the mind is, the bits of knowing. I think that's what you said, isn't it? Anyway, yeah, we experience bits of knowing. Yeah, well, it's at first your knowing is patchy, not continuous, but as you practice more, it becomes more continuous. So those bits join up, you might say. So maybe I'll leave that there, just giving you a few ideas. Wait. That question. Next question. Dear Luang Por, I am a lay woman and have been practicing mindfulness and daily meditation for 3 years. Contentment, happiness and peace are the result. My question is about meditation practice. I listen to others who describe feelings of weightlessness, of seeing their corpse and so forth, but I experience none of this. After 45 minutes, I can't feel my legs because they've gone to sleep. I know how that feels. You're not the only one. For me, it seems that insight doesn't come during formal meditation, but rather at other times. Should I be practicing differently, or am I on the right track? Thank you very much. Well, I would maybe develop the sense of I'm always learning. We're always learning from practice, meditation and other aspects, reflecting on the Dhamma, listening to the Dhamma, contemplating it. So if you have an attitude of being one who is learning from experience, everything can teach you. You get this famous phrase, everything is teaching me, or you. Everything is a teacher. So I would investigate what's going on. Sure, when other people talk about the practice, they tend to talk about the interesting, good stuff, because the boring stuff isn't much to talk about. So people don't like to say, oh, I meditate every day and I'm never peaceful, I'm always falling asleep, this, that. They don't talk about that much. They'll talk about that day they had a good insight, or they had an image of a corpse, or they experienced emptiness, or had great radiant, peaceful states of mind. Of course, that's what they'll talk about. So maybe keep it in perspective. That doesn't mean to say what these people are saying is necessarily wrong or untrue. It's only part of the story, part of the practice, and it's their practice, not yours. So as you say, you may have very kind of repetitive experiences in meditation which don't give you a lot to talk about, to tell your friends, I saw this, I heard this happened. Never mind, just keep going. Ajahn Chah always compared it to planting a tree and a tree growing, and a tree grows slowly, imperceptibly. It's not very exciting watching trees grow, but it is peaceful, but it's not very exciting. And most Dhamma practice is like that. It's small, incremental steps up the mountain towards Nibbana, small growths in insight, awareness, mindfulness, sila, generosity, all the good qualities we develop that contribute to purifying the mind of greed, anger and delusion. They tend to grow slowly and sometimes invisibly. And it's true, many people will have insights when they're not on the meditation cushion. It's often a continued effect of their meditation, formal meditation practice, whether they do sitting or walking meditation. It's not like everything stops when you get up from the meditation cushion. Yes, your mindfulness might slip away, you're putting less effort into being mindful perhaps, but if you've heard Dhamma and contemplated Dhamma before, your meditation will be one cause for your mind to maybe sometimes start reflecting on the Dhamma when you're doing much more mundane activities, going around your business. Aspects of the Dhamma may come up, maybe an experience triggers a Dhamma reflection. You hear some news about a friend who's ill, or someone who's died, or your own experiences in daily life of pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering. Things can trigger the Dhamma, can trigger insight into impermanence, letting go, understanding better what is good and bad karma. There's so many aspects of the Dhamma that can arise in daily life, but the meditation you do on a cushion or walking meditation or in a retreat will have been one factor that contributes to these kinds of insights arising. That would be my observation, and I think many other teachers and practitioners would agree. So don't underestimate just thinking about Dhamma in daily life. That's a very good thing. You're sitting on a bus going somewhere, well, think about some Dhamma that you know, reflect on your life. You may not feel you're meditating or being perfectly mindful, but you can learn a lot about yourself, the world, the Dhamma. Definitely, often very mundane, ordinary experiences can lead to insight. But you've done some preparation previously by practicing mindfulness, and these things will eventually link up. Another question. Dear Luang Por, when I'm suffering from a loss, my mind suffers, yet I realize I'm suffering. How can the practice restore normality? Patience. The Buddha said patience is the highest virtue, the highest destroyer of mental defilements, including greed, anger, delusion, and impatience. So, some things, some kinds of karma, resultant karma, take their time to work through, and probably grief and suffering over the loss of a loved one or a friend is one of the hardest ones. Because if somebody, you've built up a strong attachment, partly in a good way, there may have been a true friend, true help to you, but partly out of attachment, a delusion, a craving, that doesn't just drop away just like that. It can take a long time for your mind to settle down to accept the loss of a person you love or respect, like a teacher. Or it could be a material loss, losing a job, moving house, some change in your life circumstances, accidents, illnesses. All kinds of things can throw us off in our life, and it takes quite a while to adjust to changing circumstances, the kind of emotions that are brought up. So be patient with all that. The patience helps you get through, and patience in Buddhism means keeping your mind in a good state, functioning well while you're going through this difficulty. So whether it's painful feelings, physical pain of illness, suffering, mental pain of separation, separating from a partner, divorce or separation, loss of a loved one, all kinds of things that go wrong in life or just bring us suffering. It takes time to work through whatever emotions it brings up. They're not just going to disappear like that. For someone who's maybe very close to Nibbana, their practice may be like that, just dropping grief and sadness and anger and fear and worry and desire. They may be dropping in quite short space of time because they're very advanced in their practice. But most of us are not, so it's going to take longer, and you have the patience as you go through these longer periods of dealing with different emotional, psychological trauma and different kinds of karma that comes up in life. But if you keep patient and you keep practicing with it, you can get through, because everything is impermanent, not self, not to be clung to as self. And the patience kind of helps you to get there, as well as other qualities. I'm not saying there's not other things you have to develop: mindfulness, insight, kindness, appreciation, all kinds of good things. But the patience will certainly be a vital quality. Last question. Dear Luang Por, can you please explain what it means by suffering has its causes and is not self? Suffering, in the Buddhist term, this word dukkha, does have different explanations, but in brief, it means old age, sickness, death are suffering. Not getting what you want is suffering. You want to eat a certain kind of food, but it's not available. You have a little bit of suffering maybe. If you're very attached to that food, maybe a lot of suffering. We're always suffering over not getting what we want, something we want, some condition, some success, some material thing, some pleasurable feeling in our mind, some nice mental state we're expecting, wanting, aiming for, and we don't get. Or the suffering of getting what you don't want. The opposite of what you want comes along. So failure, misery, people don't like you, things go wrong, you lose your job, your income, you lose your income, all kinds of things. You lose your samadhi if you're a meditator. Not getting what you want or getting what you don't want. These are all kinds of suffering which you have to learn to deal with. So you identify them as this is dukkha. Try to establish some mindfulness, some awareness, and then reflect. And this is dukkha, this is what it's like. And we use these terms. It's like this. It's this characteristic. So in a kind of way of observing in a more detached way, because when you experience dukkha in smaller or bigger ways, and I only briefly touched on what we call suffering or dukkha. There's actually a lot more to that explanation, but we don't have the time here. But when dukkha arises, the first thing we do is tend to attach to it as me, mine, myself. We take ownership of it. That unpleasant emotion, that pain in the leg, that thing we said wrong, and then the reactions of other people, whatever that goes wrong in our life, we call that dukkha, and then the sense of self arises. Oh, that's me, I'm full of suffering now, I'm stressed, I'm worried, I'm angry, I'm this, I'm that. When dukkha arises and we're not mindful and not reflective, we take ownership of it, and that prolongs it and makes it bigger and worse and magnifies it, expands it, prolongs it. That's kind of what we do with suffering. So the Buddhist teaching is giving us some ways and means and tools to not do that. So be more mindful of what's going on, be more aware, pay attention, and learn and recognize what you're doing. And step back a bit, be more detached as you go through the practice, as you go through life. And you realize lots and lots and lots of your suffering will drop away when you do this. It won't completely eradicate all forms of suffering from your life, because old age, sickness and death are inevitable in whatever form. But what you think about them and the mental suffering we create around these experiences, that's what you can fix quite quickly. So the sense of ownership of suffering will drop away through the power of mindfulness and insight, wisdom. That's what we're aiming for in the practice. So that's the end of the questions tonight. So now we can have our final verse.